So today I thought I'd talk about story structures. I'm just going to cover a few today, I think. I think you'll see why after the third or fourth, because they start feeling very similar, with one real notable exception. So let's get into it. Let's start off with the most popular right now, The Hero's Journey. This was popularized in the book Hero with a Thousand Faces by Campbell, written in 1949. It can be traced back, though, as far as 1871, and its most popular iteration is slightly simplified and is by Christopher Vogler. And the image you're seeing is one of myriad examples of the hero's journey. This one doesn't suit your liking. There are others that might. And it's a pretty well established structure. You see it everywhere. And in some of the most popular stories that exist, like Lord of the Rings, which pretty rigidly holds to the structure. So let's talk a little bit about each step. The particular one I'm talking about is going to have 12 steps, and then you'll have a better understanding of the hero's journey, I guess. So the first step is just the ordinary world. This image doesn't really show it, but it's the starting point, and it's basically setting up the status quo. You're introduced to the character. You're told what their normal world looks like. That normal world may not be normal by real world standards, but it's normal to the character. After that, you have the call to adventure, which is the plot point that disrupts the status quo, that causes the hero to need to do something different than what they normally do. And after that is there's another one that isn't on the graphic, but it's the refusal of the call. This isn't always in the stories, but it's Frodo saying no, I'm not doing that, or Bilbo saying no, I'm not doing that. It's the reluctance of the hero to have a change of status quo. Around that time, you also introduce the mentor. It, it it can vary. The mentor can come in before or after the step I'm going to talk about next, but it's also pretty self-explanatory. It's the wise old wizard. It's Gandalf basically. In various forms, that's the purpose, to introduce someone who will teach the hero about the new world that they find themselves in. And after that, you get crossing the first threshold. You'll see there's a big horizontal line with known and unknown on this graphic. This is where they're, well, crossing past that line. They've started on their adventure. They're accepting that the status quo has to change. In the immediate after of crossing the threshold, you start meeting enemies and allies and facing challenges. You'll also see commonly that the mentor is supposed to die somewhere in this period or after it, but I don't think that's strictly necessary. But it's Obi-Wan getting killed by Vader or Yoda dying of old age. But after that, the hero has learned about their new world. They're getting more powerful, they're getting better, they're journeying on, and then they must approach the inmost cave. This isn't generally a literal thing, even though you see Luke enter a cave, and even though you see Rey enter a cave, that's not the actual story point that it is. When Luke is going to rescue Leia from the Death Star, that's approaching the inmost cave. It's the buildup of tension to the climax. It's the hero preparing and being stressed out and starting on the way to the climactic events of the story. And of course, after that is the ordeal, the actual climax of the story. Um, Following the climax, of course, is the reward. This is normally not a life changing reward. It's just a general acknowledgement that they've succeeded. You see this with Frodo getting acknowledged by Aragorn as the new king, but they didn't really gain anything beyond that acknowledgement. They get to live, they've had their wounds seen to, and the world acknowledges that they did a good thing. But that's really all there was to it. The final part, if you want to break it down to 3 acts, it's the third act is the return. And that starts with the road back. And this is a fake out ending. In the hero's journey, the road back is meant to lull the reader into a false sense of security. That the story's over, everything's been faced, and we're moving on. However, in this, there's the resurrection, which is the secondary climax, I guess. It's Frodo returning to the Shire to find that Saruman has taken over and is making lives miserable, and they have to, defeat the bad guy again. I'm not a huge fan of this part of the hero's journey. I get that it's part of this particular story structure. It's just the part that I'm the least fond of. After that, it's the return with the elixir. It's the actual reward. It's Frodo going on the ship, but that is the hero's journey. It's once you know it, you'll see it everywhere. It's pretty hard to miss because most stories follow this kind of structure. You'll also see that most structures start to get a little samey. So I guess let's move on to the next story structure. And this one it's kind of independent of the hero's journey, but the next one I want to talk about is the 7-point structure. The 7-point structure was popularized by Dan Wells and is much simpler, and that's not a bad thing. It gives the author more wiggle room. So I think I like it more than the hero's journey just because it gives more room for the author to work within the bounds of it. It's pretty straightforward. The hook is very similar to just the call to the adventure, that part of the story. You're introducing the character, you're setting up what the current status quo is, and the first plot turn is what sets the story in motion. So everything before the first plot turn is just setup. And after you've gotten your first plot turn and you've explored that, your character's on their way to resolving that, you get a pinch point, which is often when an antagonist is introduced, it's just putting pressure on the hero. Shortly after the pinch point, you'll get about to the middle of the book, and this is where your character moves from reaction to action. And shortly after that, you'll see your hero become more assertive. You'll get the second pinch point, which is the fall before the rise. It's where the hero reaches their darkest point. It puts the most amount of pressure on them. And the plot turn 2 is about them recovering from that, discovering the thing they need to beat the enemy and resolving that and coming back from their lowest point. They've hit rock bottom and now you get to see them climb out of it. And that, of course, leads to the resolution, which is just the climax of the story. You see, this is a much more simple structure, but there's a lot more wiggle room there. You don't have to have this false ending and a second climax and all that. You just get a basic story structure that's really kind of just a 3-plot structure, a 3-act structure, but worded differently. And speaking of the 3-act structure, I think we should talk about that next. So the 3-act structure takes the simplification to its most simplified. Act 1 is you're setting up the plot, you're giving the inciting incident for what causes the story to exist, and you're ending the first act on the major plot point, what's causing the hero to go out on their adventure. The second act is kind of the meat of the story. It's where they're dealing with learning about what's going on, confronting problems, and naturally the middle of the book is going to be here. the Act 2 will end on the second major plot point, which is where the hero is again falling. They're reaching their low point so they can rise up and become stronger. And Act 3 is basically just the climax. They have, after Act 2 they fall to the lowest point. They go into Act 3 and the climax starts building. And of course, then the book ends. This is easily the most simple structure that I want to talk about today, but you can see that the 7-point story is very similar to the 3-act structure. And moving on from the 3-act structure, we're going to get just more detailed 3-act structures. So let's move into the one that name amuses me the most, and that is Save the Cat. It's named that because some point in Blake's screenwriting book, they say something to the effect of the hero has to save the cat. It isn't a literal cat, but it's them saving the day. And this is really just an expansion of the 3-act structure with a lot of hints of the hero's journey mixed in. In Act 1, they put the opening, which is the start, introducing you to the world, and from there they go into a setup, and that's setting up the status quo. Again, this is just building up our understanding of who the hero is. After setup, there's the catalyst. This is the cause for the change in status quo. And that's all it is, just that event that changes the status quo. Following that is debate. And debate is the conflict that arose from the catalyst. It's the hero having a problem with accepting this catalyst, with the change in status quo. In the hero's journey, it's the refusal of the call. I tend to find the refusal of the call a little annoying, but I understand why it's there. A lot of people don't like change, and that's what the catalyst is forcing. So debate is it's the hero dealing with the reluctance to change the status quo, or dealing with any other internal issues that the catalyst caused. And that ends Act 1 in Save the Cat. The image I'm showing up doesn't have it broken into act structures, but debate is the end of Act 1. Act 2 is breaking into 2. It's really where the hero has decided to go on the journey. They've dealt with their internal conflicts, whatever they were, and they've decided to accept the fact that the world has changed and they need to do something about it. At this point, you're introducing important characters that the hero is going to interact with along the way. And then you get to fun and games. This is the meat of the book. It's going to cover a huge portion of your book, and it's not, the name is a bit misleading. It's not all fun and games. It's just where the hero is going. You'll see subplots breaking out here. You'll see them learning about this new world or getting prepared for the ordeal that they're going to have to deal with. It's just where most of the story in this kind of structure takes place. After that, you get the midpoint. This is generally where you'll get a false victory or a false defeat, and you'll have to start dealing with that. But it's also where bad things start closing in. The enemy's moving, the army is approaching. It's raising the tension. The bad stuff closes in is really kind of part of the midpoint and also takes place there. It's also a fairly large chunk of the book. Fun and games and midpoint make up probably about 50% of the book in this structure. After that, you get All Is Lost. This is, again, the low point. You see this a lot in the various story structures. It's the hero at their lowest point so they can rise up and defeat the bad guy. And after that is the Darkest Night of the Soul, which is a weird name, but it's where the hero discovers the thing they need. It's the start of the rise from rock bottom, and they figure out what they need, whatever that MacGuffin is. They figure it out, and now they know how to defeat whatever the bad guy is. And that is generally the end of Act 2 in this structure. So then we move to Act 3, break into 3. It's just it's a continuation of The Dark Knight. It's the hero now knows how to fix the problem, and now they're going about getting prepared to do that. It's the inmost cave in the hero's journey. The tension is raising, they know what they need to do, and they're getting to that finale, which of course is the next point. It's the finale, it's the climax, where the big bad loses. And after that is really just the end. It's the final image. The finale also contains the return home, and I don't really like the opening image and final image names of this structure, but it works. After that, there's only one more I want to talk about. It's the 27 chapter method. I don't have a graphic for this. The 27 chapter method is really just the same as Save the Cat with a few extra steps. You see some inclusion of a phrasing used from the 7 point story. You see some inclusion of the hero's journey, but the 27 chapter method is really just Save the Cat with extra steps. It tries to more formalize the chapter structure. I find that pointless because I don't read books that are 27 chapters long. I'm not sure if it's meant to be literal or not, but it really just looked like Save the Cat to me, so I'm not going to bother explaining it. But that concludes the ones I wanted to talk about today. If you like this video, please leave a like. If not, a dislike. And are there any kinds of story structure that you like instead of these? Or is one of these a structure that you prefer to see in your books? Please let me know in the comment section. I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day.